I'm biracial, so Indigenous on my mom's side, French on my dad's side. And I think one of the hardest parts, I don't know if it's hard, maybe weird is a better word. One of the weirdest parts for me was just the requirement of performing being Indigenous. I was on TikTok making content when Modern Warrior was at his height of popularity. And I always heard what he had to say about people who didn't look overtly Indigenous. And that was in his mind that they weren't Indigenous. And if you were biracial, you weren't Indigenous unless you were 100% and you could tell just by looking at you. And I remember watching him and another creator who was also Indigenous going back and forth, and him calling that other creator colonizer all the time. That really did make me hesitate in ever talking about the fact that I was Indigenous. I had been making content on TikTok for like 5 years, and that was before I started bringing up the fact that I was Indigenous. And it was very much because of concern. And even when I started talking about it, I had so many people from other groups, other races, wanting me to perform being Indigenous. And that's really what it feels like to me, is it's a performance. You want me to present in a way that is like super obvious to you. Like, you want me to wear the bearded earrings, you want me to go to powwows, you want me to record it, you want me to post it, you want me to be very public about my experience in the Indigenous community as a performance for you. Not for care of the fact that I am, not for the experience that it is, but because then you can put me into this nice little box of what you consider me to be. Because a lot of the times when I talk on the internet specifically, I always get called a white woman and my opinions get diminished just for being a woman, right? But then when I say, no, I'm Indigenous, then that gets weaponized against me as well. And it's really like interesting, because when we talk about race and when we talk about ethnicity and when we talk about nationality, and I say that I'm like very Canadian, and I tell people I'm very Canadian because on one side I'm Indigenous, on the other side I'm French Canadian. Like, je parle français, but I don't speak Ojibwe because that language wasn't something I was exposed to a lot as a kid, because at one point it was illegal. So there's a sense of like people also not understanding how disconnected you can be from your own culture, because that was the intent of the government, and like the weaponization of legal documents against Indigenous people. Like, it was illegal for Indigenous people to gather beyond, I think it's like 3 or 4 people. It was illegal for Indigenous people to hire legal representation. It was illegal, like a federal crime, if you gave an Indigenous person money to hire a lawyer, because what they were doing was so actually illegal. They didn't want Indigenous people to be able to get representation to point out the fact that what they were doing was illegal. And like, I have so many friends back home. I'm from Thunder Bay, Ontario. And if you go on Prime, there's actually a documentary about Thunder Bay and how bad it is, how racist it is. And I have friends who quite literally hid that they were Indigenous their entire lives. Their parents would not give them their card. They would not allow them to tell people that they were Indigenous for fear of them being targeted. That's what I grew up around. That's what I witnessed my entire 10 years old and up. And so when people are super ignorant and they come on here, like, the dynamics in Canada are different than the dynamics in the United States. And when I say I'm an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman, I get this pushback of like, I don't look it enough. And I just look at these people. Like, what does Indigenous look like to you? Does it look like the caricatures that they've made on TV for you? Like, are they the old Indian and cowboy movies that you used to watch or that your grandparents watched? Is that what gave you the definition of what an Indigenous person, one, sounds like, looks like, talks like, speaks like, and their culture? And like, when I was in high school, I was friends with so many kids from the reserve. Like, so many of my friends were Indigenous. And I remember telling them at the time that I was Indigenous. And even back then, and it's now, like, I understand the language is like lateral violence, but I would tell them I was Indigenous, and then they would look at me, and they looked at like this Portuguese guy in our group, and they were like, he's darker than you. And so if he looks more Indigenous, so if you're Indigenous, then he's Indigenous. And I just like, sometimes I think about like how performative people need other people to be in order to believe their reality. And not even that, like, a lot of the problems within the Indigenous community, not even problems, a lot of the things that people in the Indigenous community are facing is generational trauma. And it's like, I come on here and I'm a DV advocate and I talk about my experience in a traumatic and abusive relationship, and then people look at me and go, yeah, but like, you're white presenting, you look white. And it's like, that doesn't change the historical things that happened to my family, you know what I mean?